What's up? How y'all doing? Sugarmonger. Just want to do some thoughts on the Buck 110 Folding Hunter. How y'all doing? The Buck 110, right? This is straight up classic knife shit right here. Developed in 1963, came out in 1964. It's originally a 440C, then they moved to 425M. Then from there they moved to a 420HC, which this particular model is. They've been making it in that particular steel for like 30 years now, almost like 25 years. Excellent steel for the price. Well, it's not actually. It's an excellent knife for the price, right? Because a 420HC isn't normally a steel that anyone is gonna like. Ooh, that's a really nice steel. You know, it's not something that's gonna pique anyone's interest. But realistically, it's nothing to sneer at, especially with Buck's treatment, right? The way Buck does their knives, it holds an edge decently well for the amount of just strength that the blade has. It's very strong steel, very tough steel. It's not the hardest steel. It's not going to give you the greatest edge retention, but as far as the stain resistance that it has, a minimal risk of chipping or breaking, damaging the blade. So it's a good steel, for the price, for what you're getting. The handle is just beautiful, right? And the Folding Hunter, honestly, I think this knife here will excel at hunting skinning the best. I don't really know. I'm not a hunter. I don't skin anything. But with most knives, right? Most modern folders. This isn't a very good example, but it's the one I've got in my pocket right now, right? This is a Microtech Ultratech, and it's got a forward weight. The balance point on this particular knife, right, is about right there. Right behind the button. So when you hold this, all of that weight is out forward. So if I were to make any sort of cutting motion, this is with basically any knife, right? Almost any folding knife out on the market now, is the balance point. It makes it so the weight of the knife is actually contacting whatever you're cutting, right? It's the actual weight of the knife itself giving pressure onto the surface, right? The balance point on this thing when it's open is so far back. I mean, it's like right here. You know what I mean? It's so far back and it's inside your hand. So the balance point is sitting right here in my hand, right? When I'm holding it like this. So all of the weight, all of the pressure, anything that I contact that surface with is me. There's no weight from the blade forcing the blade down, right? So I have an extreme amount of control with this knife. I can put the amount of pressure that I need to in the spot that I need to. There's no weight. I'm not fighting the weight of the knife. It's all in my hand, right? And so it's very maneuverable, very good for intricate tasks. Again, I go back to the hunting because I imagine you can see how I'm holding this thing. I'm holding it all the way up, and this is very comfortable. It's very maneuverable. It gives me an extra feeling of control. With any knife, you can do an intricate cut with any knife if you really know what you're doing. I mean, you can use a hawk bill to skin a deer if you're really skilled enough. Nobody's going to do that. But I mean, if you're really skilled enough, and so it just makes it feel better. It feels easier, especially with the swedge here. You can see how narrow of a tip this thing comes down into. It's not like a needle for sure. There's still a decent amount of steel up there at the tip, but you can see with that swedge, it's got an excellent penetration capability just because of the actual curvature of the belly there. It's very thin behind the cutting edge. It's a very sharp knife. This hollow grind that they have comes down to right there behind the cutting edge is almost minimalistic. It's very thin, very, very small, or very good dimensions. Great cutting great cutting dimensions right there behind the actual cutting edge, and it flares up onto that really high saber grind, so it gives you so much steel to actually work with. Another thing from Buck that I really like is the designation. You can actually tell what year these were made. Don't quote me, but I want to say this thing is 2013, and you can actually go look up and see if that's correct. If this is 2013, I'm pretty sure that it is, but I'm not positive. Cocobolo wood handles. And I mean, this is attributed a lot. I've heard a lot of people say that this was the first tactical knife, right? This is like the first gentleman's tactical folder or whatever. It's not. This was not the first tactical knife. It bugs me when people say that because this knife made its first introduction in 1964. If you're familiar with why automatics are illegal, most automatic knives are illegal because of the media in the 40s and the 50s with things like a stiletto, right? That's an automatic folding knife. That's a stiletto has been around since before the turn of the century, you know, before in the late 1800s. And I mean, it was a very expensive knife. It wasn't something that most people could easily get their hands on. They were hard to manufacture and they were expensive. And that's what this thing did. This thing, the Buck 110, brought that realm of locking knife into a achievable world, you know, into an actually you can get it. It's not intimidating. It doesn't, you know, because there was still that gangster stigma behind a stiletto or a switchblade, you know. So with that, you know, that's where this came in. This is a gentleman's knife. It's not a fighting knife. It's not designed for just killing. It's a utility hunting knife, right? And that's where the Buck, I think the Buck 110 really got its shine, really got its mark. It wasn't that it was the first one on the market. It was the first, I mean, it did revolutionize the locking system. I mean, the lockback here was pretty revolutionary when they first came out with this. Again, they did not invent this lockback system. Buck did not invent that. Well, Buck might have. I'm not sure who invented it, but it was not original to the 110. A lot of people think that it was. This was just the first knife that really brought that into the market, really brought that into the society, you know, so that anyone could really afford it. Not anyone, because back in the day, these weren't cheap knives. They're on the lesser expensive end now. I mean, you can get them for 50, 60 bucks, but back in the day, this was a pretty high-end product if you got one in the 1960s. And that's where the buck knife comes in, right? You hear people talk about buck knives, especially if you're really into knives. You always hear the term buck knife, right? And this is what they're talking about. They're either talking about this Buck 110 right here or the Buck 119 Special, right? They both came out in the 60s. They're both very classic knives, and they've both been sold millions and millions and millions and millions of them, right? And every once in a while, when I've got a fixed blade on, somebody says, "Oh, you have a buck knife," and I'm like, "No, I don't. I don't have a buck knife because this is not a buck knife. I'm not carrying a 119. I'm not carrying this 110. When somebody says I have a buck knife, nobody has. But if somebody says I have a buck knife and I had this thing on my hip, I would freaking freak out. I would hug them because that is awesome if they even knew that, right? But it's never happened to me. One thing I will give with this knife, I am not the biggest fan of. If you're a fan of the Apostle P channel, right, he's got a video on the 50th anniversary version of this knife, and he's got some problems with the blade actually smacking down into the backspacer. And I have got the exact same issue. You can see there on that backspacer, there's a little bit of deformation to the backspacer. It's just scratched up right there on that edge. And right up here on the tip of the knife, you see that roll right there? There's nothing I can do about that, because every time I close this knife, it slams into that piece of metal. You hear that? That is the blade, tip of the blade hitting that backspacer. So it's not, with everything that I had just said, it's going to be an amazing hunting knife. It's going to be a great knife, all of that. It's so controllable. You can do all of that. None of that matters. None of that comes into play when you don't have a sharp tip. If your belly isn't sharp, I can't skin anything with this. I can't use that. So as awesome as this knife is, I would like to get the good stuff out first because I don't want to give the impression that I don't like this knife. I freaking love this knife, but the quality has gone down so much that you need to actually modify your knife to have it be usable. So Buck 110, excellent knife, beautifully classic design, but realistically showing the problems in American manufacturing. Skipping corners, I don't know what they did to change that. I don't know what they did, but I never heard of that problem right there with any knife before the 50th anniversary. I bought this one like the next year. Buck 110. Man, if you only got 60 bucks, honestly, and you don't want a tactical folder, you're not really just, oh, I need something tactical that's got stopping protection that I can stab with, and all of that, if you don't want that, I think this is one of the more satisfying knives on the market. It's just nice. It just makes me feel like I have something nice, which is weird. Y'all have a good one.